Never trust a fighter pilot who says their plane can't be fixed because engineers in Detroit said so, because on a muddy airstrip in Guadalcanal in 1943, one grease-covered mechanic with a wrench and a death wish proved that sometimes the best solution to a multi-million-dollar engineering problem is a piece of scrap tubing held together with wire and pure stubbornness. The Pacific Theater was eating American fighters alive, and the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, that beautiful twin-engine beast that was supposed to dominate the skies, was dying on the ground faster than Japanese Zeros could shoot them down. But nobody in command wanted to admit that the problem wasn't enemy bullets. It was something far more embarrassing, something that would make Lockheed engineers back in Burbank want to crawl into a hole and disappear forever. Picture this. It's August 1943, and you're standing on Henderson Field in Guadalcanal, that miserable strip of coral and mud that thousands of men died to capture, and you're watching P-38s taxi back from patrol missions with their engines literally cooking themselves to death. White smoke pouring from the cowlings, pilots climbing out drenched in sweat and screaming about cockpit temperatures that could fry eggs on the instrument panel. These weren't minor inconveniences. These were aircraft that cost more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes, sitting useless because somewhere between California and the South Pacific, someone forgot that jungle heat isn't the same as Burbank sunshine. The P-38 Lightning was supposed to be America's answer to Japanese air superiority, this twin-boom monster with two Allison engines pumping out over 3,000 horsepower combined, armed with four 50-caliber machine guns and a 20-millimeter cannon, all mounted in the nose, no synchronization needed because there was no propeller in the way. Just pure, concentrated firepower pointing wherever the nose pointed. Pilots who flew her called her the fork-tailed devil, a name the Germans gave her in Europe, and in theory she was perfect for the Pacific. Long range for those endless ocean patrols, heavy firepower for shredding bombers, speed to run down anything the Japanese put in the air. But theory and reality started divorcing the moment these birds touched down on tropical airstrips. The problems started showing up within weeks of deployment, and at first everyone blamed combat damage, or poor maintenance, or pilots pushing the engines too hard. All the usual suspects when military equipment starts failing. But then the pattern became impossible to ignore. P-38s that had never seen combat were overheating during taxi. Pilots were aborting missions because their engine temperatures were climbing into the red before they even left the ground, and the few birds that made it into the air were coming back with blown cylinders and cracked engine blocks. Ground crews were working 18-hour days trying to keep these fighters flying, and they were losing the battle. Not against the Japanese, but against thermodynamics. See, the P-38's cooling system was a masterpiece of engineering when it worked. Each Allison V1710 engine had its own independent cooling circuit, liquid coolant flowing through passages in the cylinder heads and engine block, carrying away the tremendous heat generated by 12 cylinders firing thousands of times per minute. The coolant would flow to radiators mounted in the wing leading edges, those distinctive chin radiators that gave the P-38 its aggressive look, where air rushing past at hundreds of miles per hour would cool the liquid before it circulated back into the engine. Beautiful system, elegant, efficient. Assuming you're flying in moderate temperatures at altitude where the air is thin and cold. Guadalcanal wasn't moderate anything. ground temperatures regularly hit 100 degrees Fahrenheit with humidity so thick you could practically swim through it. And the P-38s sitting on that coral strip were trying to cool themselves with air that was barely cooler than the engines themselves. The radiators designed to work perfectly at 20,000 feet were nearly useless at sea level in tropical heat, like trying to cool a furnace by blowing on it with a hairdryer. But here's where it gets worse. The cooling system had another problem that nobody at Lockheed had anticipated. The layout of the coolant lines themselves created hot spots where coolant would pool and heat up even more, instead of flowing smoothly through the system. The lines ran from the engine back to the radiators in a path that made perfect sense on a blueprint, but in practice created sections where coolant would slow down, almost stagnate, and these sections would heat up even more than the rest of the system. It was like a traffic jam where cars just sit and overheat, except these traffic jams were happening inside engines that needed constant cooling to not tear themselves apart. Engineers back at Lockheed knew about the problem, sort of. They'd received reports from the field about overheating, but from California, these seemed like isolated incidents, maybe bad fuel, maybe poor maintenance, maybe pilots being rough on the engines. The idea that their beautiful design had a fundamental flaw that only showed up in specific conditions wasn't something they wanted to hear, and even if they acknowledged it, what were they supposed to do? Redesign the entire cooling system and retrofit every P-38 in the Pacific? That would take months or years and cost millions of dollars. So the official response was essentially tough luck. Operate within specifications. Don't push the engines too hard. Try to manage the problem. That advice was spectacularly useless to the men on Guadalcanal, who needed every fighter they could get into the air because Japanese bombers weren't going to stop coming just because American fighters had cooling problems. The ground crews were desperate. These weren't factory technicians with clean workshops and unlimited parts. These were mechanics who'd learned their trade fixing tractors in Iowa or hot rods in Detroit, guys who enlisted or got drafted and found themselves on a tropical island, trying to keep million-dollar fighters flying with whatever they could scrounge. They tried everything they could think of within normal procedures. They adjusted mixture settings to run the engines leaner and cooler. They modified the cowl flaps to allow more airflow. They even tried running the engines with panels removed to increase ventilation. Nothing worked, or nothing worked well enough. They'd gain maybe 5 or 10 degrees of cooling, but the engines were still running way too hot, still blowing gaskets and cracking blocks. Then one day, a mechanic named Charlie Boswell — nobody remembers his exact rank, but everyone who was there remembered his name — was lying under a P-38 with coolant dripping on his face, trying to figure out why this particular bird kept overheating worse than the others. He'd replaced every component he could think of, new thermostat, new water pump, even swapped out sections of coolant line, thinking maybe there was a blockage somewhere. Nothing helped. This Lightning was determined to cook itself, no matter what he did. And while he was lying there in the mud, covered in coolant and grease, and probably questioning every life choice that led him to this moment, he noticed something about the way the coolant lines were routed. They took this long winding path from the engine to the radiator, lots of bends and turns, and in several spots the lines ran close to hot engine components, exhaust manifolds and such, which meant the coolant was actually getting heated up again while it was supposed to be on its way to get cooled. It was the dumbest thing he'd ever seen. and he couldn't understand how engineers making 10 times his salary had designed it this way. Now a smart person, or maybe just a person who valued their career, would have written this observation up in a report and sent it up the chain of command and waited for someone to authorize a proper engineering solution. Charlie Boswell was not that person, or maybe he was just too tired and too frustrated to care about proper procedure anymore. He looked at the existing coolant lines, looked at the pile of scrap tubing sitting in the corner of the maintenance tent, tubing from wrecked aircraft and damaged parts that were too good to throw away, but not good enough to be official spare parts, and he had an idea that was either brilliant or completely insane. What if he just bypassed the entire stupid factory routing and ran the coolant lines directly from the engine to the radiator? The shortest possible path, avoiding all the hot spots and reducing the number of bends where coolant could slow down. Just straight shot, in and out, simple. The problem was this wasn't authorized. He didn't have engineering drawings for this modification. He didn't have approval from anyone. He'd be taking a wrench to a military aircraft and modifying its systems based on nothing but his gut feeling that it would work. If he was wrong, if this modification caused an engine failure or, God forbid, caused a crash, he'd be lucky if they only court-martialed him. But if he was right, if this crazy idea actually worked, he could get dozens of fighters back in the air, fighters that were desperately needed, pilots who were currently sitting around because there weren't enough working aircraft. Charlie made his decision, and he didn't ask permission because he knew what the answer would be. He grabbed some of that scrap tubing, most of it salvaged from aircraft that had been shot up or crashed. Tubing that was never meant to be coolant lines but was the right diameter and made of the right material. He carefully measured out the lengths he needed, cutting the shortest possible path from engine to radiator. Then he disconnected the factory coolant lines and started fitting his improvised replacements. The tubing didn't have proper fittings, so he had to get creative, using hose clamps and layers of rubber sealing material, anything to make sure the connections wouldn't leak under pressure. Some sections he had to bend carefully to make them fit around other components, and he secured everything with safety wire, miles of safety wire, wrapping every connection and support point because the last thing he needed was for a line to come loose in flight. The whole modification looked like something out of a junkyard. Nothing like the clean factory installation, but when he was done, the coolant had a straight shot from engine to radiator and back. No unnecessary bends, no hot spots, just simple, efficient flow. He spent an entire day on this modification, working through the heat and the afternoon rain that turned everything to mud, and by the time he was finished, he was so covered in grime that his own crew chief walked past without recognizing him. Then came the moment of truth. He filled the cooling system with coolant, checked for leaks, found about a dozen, fixed them, checked again. Once he was satisfied that the system would hold pressure, he got permission to run the engine, just a ground test. Nothing crazy. The crew chief looked at Charlie's modification, and his face went through about 6 different expressions: confusion, horror, understanding, more horror, resignation, and finally something like hope. He didn't ask if this was authorized because he didn't want to know the answer. He just said, "Make it quick before someone important shows up." Charlie climbed into the cockpit, went through the startup checklist, and hit the ignition on the right engine. The Allison coughed sputtered, then roared to life with that distinctive sound that everyone on the airfield knew. 1,200 horsepower of American engineering doing what it was built to do. He let it warm up, watching the temperature gauges like a hawk. And here's where his heart probably stopped for a moment, because the temperature started climbing just like always, up past normal operating range, heading toward the red line where they'd normally shut down to prevent damage. But then something different happened. The temperature stopped climbing, it held steady for a moment, then actually started dropping, settling into the normal range and staying there. Charlie sat in that cockpit, running the engine at various power settings for 20 minutes, and the temperature never budged from normal, staying right in the sweet spot like the engine was happy for the first time since arriving in the Pacific. He shut down, climbed out, and found that half the ground crew had gathered to watch because word had spread that crazy Charlie was doing something unauthorized to one of the birds. The crew chief looked at the temperature log, looked at Charlie, looked at the jury-rigged coolant lines, and said something that probably can't be repeated in polite company, but which amounted to, "We're doing this to every P-38 on the field." That's when the real work began, because modifying one aircraft as an experiment was one thing. Modifying an entire squadron without official approval was the kind of decision that could end careers. But the squadron commander, a major who'd flown enough combat missions to know exactly how desperate their situation was, made the call. He looked at Charlie's modification, looked at the rows of overheating P-38s that were basically expensive paperweights, looked at the combat roster that showed they had maybe 8 or 9 flyable fighters when they were supposed to have 30, and he said, "Do it, modify them all. I'll deal with the paperwork later." Over the next week, Charlie and his crew worked around the clock, pulling apart cooling systems that Lockheed engineers had spent months designing and replacing them with improvised systems cobbled together from scrap parts and mechanical intuition. Each aircraft took most of a day to modify because they had to be careful. One mistake, and they could cause more problems than they solved. But gradually, the pile of unflyable fighters started shrinking. They'd modify a bird, test-run the engines, watch the temperatures stay normal, sign it off as ready for flight, move to the next one. The pilots noticed immediately when they started flying. The modified aircraft, cockpit temperatures that had been borderline unbearable dropped to almost comfortable. Engine temperatures stayed in the green even during hard climbs in full tropical heat, and most importantly, they could actually complete missions without worrying about their engines seizing up over enemy territory. One pilot reported that he'd been in a dogfight at low altitude, full throttle for nearly 10 minutes. The kind of fight that would normally have his engines cooking and his temperatures barely moved, staying rock steady in normal range. The modified P-38s were performing better than they ever had, not because someone added more power or better weapons, but because someone fixed a problem that should never have existed in the first place. Word started spreading to other units in the Pacific, these cryptic references to field modifications that were getting results, and mechanics started showing up on Guadalcanal asking Charlie how he did it. He'd walk them through the modification, pointing out the routing he used, the way he secured the lines, the types of fittings that worked best. And these mechanics would go back to their own units and start doing the same modifications. It was spreading through the Pacific theater like wildfire, this unauthorized fix that nobody official wanted to talk about, but everyone knew was keeping fighters in the air. Eventually, someone at headquarters noticed that maintenance reports from Pacific P-38 units showed a dramatic drop in cooling-related failures, and they wanted to know what changed. The initial reports from the field were vague: improvements to maintenance procedures, better understanding of operating limitations, the kind of bureaucratic language that doesn't actually say anything. But eventually someone demanded specifics, and that's when the truth came out. Ground crews across the Pacific had been modifying the cooling systems of their aircraft using improvised parts and unauthorized procedures, and, oh, by the way, it was working spectacularly well. This put headquarters in an awkward position. On one hand, these modifications were completely unauthorized. They violated about 17 different regulations regarding aircraft modification and maintenance procedures, and the people doing them could theoretically be court-martialed. On the other hand, the modifications were working. They were working better than the original design. And trying to crack down on them would mean grounding fighters that were desperately needed. The brass did what military bureaucracies often do when faced with an impossible situation. They looked the other way and pretended it wasn't happening, while quietly telling Lockheed that maybe they should look into this cooling issue more seriously. Lockheed eventually sent a team of engineers to the Pacific to examine these field modifications, and you can imagine that was an uncomfortable meeting. These engineers who'd spent years designing this aircraft being shown how some mechanics with no formal engineering training had fixed a fundamental design flaw using scrap parts. To their credit, the Lockheed engineers didn't try to defend the original design. They looked at what the mechanics had done, ran some tests, did some calculations, and basically said, "Yeah, this is actually better. We should have done it this way from the start." They ended up incorporating Charlie's basic approach into an official modification kit that got sent to P-38 units, though of course the official version used proper parts and fittings rather than scrap tubing and safety wire. But here's the thing that often gets forgotten in this story. By the time Lockheed developed their official fix and started distributing modification kits, the war had moved on. The mechanics in the field had already solved the problem months earlier. Those improvised modifications had already saved dozens, if not hundreds, of missions, had already kept pilots alive who would have been grounded or forced to fly dangerously overheating aircraft. The official fix was nice to have, but it was retroactive. It was validation. After the fact, it was the engineering establishment finally catching up to what the people actually using the equipment had figured out through necessity and desperation. Charlie Boswell never got a medal for his modification. There was no ceremony or official recognition, because to do that would be to admit that the original design was flawed and that unauthorized modifications had been necessary. He went back to his regular maintenance duties, kept working 18-hour days, keeping fighters flying, and eventually rotated back to the States when his tour was up. But the pilots who flew those modified P-38s knew what he'd done. The mechanics who learned from his example knew. And somewhere in the maintenance logs and mission reports from the Pacific Theater in 1943 and 1944, there's this invisible thread of aircraft that should have been grounded but kept flying because one mechanic decided that regulations were less important than results. The broader lesson here goes way beyond one fighter plane in one war. It's about the difference between engineering in a clean room versus engineering in the real world, about how the perfect solution designed under ideal conditions often falls apart when it meets actual operating conditions. The P-38's cooling system worked fine in California. It worked fine in testing. It probably would have worked fine in Europe, where American fighters operated at high altitude in cooler temperatures, but nobody thought to test it properly in tropical conditions at low altitude, or if they did test it, they didn't test it long enough or hard enough to find the problem. And even when the problem became obvious, even when field reports were screaming that there was an issue, the response from the engineering side was slow and bureaucratic, focused on working within the existing system rather than acknowledging that the system itself was the problem. Charlie and mechanics like him didn't have the luxury of waiting for official solutions. They had pilots depending on them. They had a war to fight. They had enemies who weren't going to wait around while someone in California drew up proper engineering specifications. So they did what mechanics have done since the beginning of time. They looked at the problem with fresh eyes, unburdened by assumptions about how things were supposed to work. They improvised with whatever materials they had available, and they tested their solutions in the most unforgiving laboratory possible. Actual combat operations where failure meant people died. This pattern repeated itself throughout the war in all theaters with all kinds of equipment, field modifications that solved real problems, while official channels slowly ground through the process of acknowledging issues and developing fixes. Tanks got improvised armor welded on by unit workshops. Radios got modified to work better in tropical humidity. Weapons got adapted to use captured ammunition or to work in conditions the designers never anticipated. Some of these modifications were brilliant, some were dangerous, some were just plain weird, but they all represented the same principle. The people using the equipment often understand its limitations better than the people who designed it, and necessity drives innovation faster than any formal process. The P-38 eventually got its official cooling system fix and went on to be one of the most successful American fighters in the Pacific, the plane that Richard Bong used to become America's top ace with 40 confirmed kills, the plane that shot down Admiral Yamamoto's transport in 1943, the plane that flew more combat missions in the Pacific than almost any other American fighter. But in those crucial months in 1943, when the Solomon Islands campaign was in full swing and every fighter mattered, it was those improvised modifications held together with scrap tubing and safety wire that kept the P-38s flying. There's something almost poetic about the contrast between the P-38 itself, this sleek technological marvel representing the cutting edge of aviation engineering, and the crude field modifications that made it actually work, like the difference between a beautiful theory and an ugly fact, and in war, ugly facts that work beat beautiful theories every single time. Charlie's modification also highlights something about the culture of ground crews in World War II. These guys were not just mechanics following maintenance manuals. They were problem solvers who took personal responsibility for keeping their aircraft flying. They worked in conditions that would shut down a modern maintenance facility, no climate control, limited tools, parts that took weeks to arrive if they arrived at all, working in mud or dust or both, dealing with equipment that was being used far harder than it was designed for. And they made it work through a combination of technical skill, creative thinking, and sheer stubborn determination to not let their pilots down. The relationship between pilots and ground crews was built on this trust. Pilots trusted that when they climbed into a cockpit, the airplane would work because the mechanics had done everything humanly possible to make it work, and mechanics took that trust seriously. It wasn't just professional pride, it was personal. When you've spent all day fixing a fighter and you watch the pilot taxi out on a combat mission, you're invested in that pilot coming back alive. And if they don't come back, you take it. Personally, you wonder if there was something else you could have checked, something else you could have done. That's the context in which Charlie's modification happened. It wasn't just about fixing a technical problem, it was about keeping faith with the pilots who depended on them. Modern aircraft maintenance is a completely different world. Everything is regulated and documented and controlled because we learned the hard way that improvisation can be dangerous, that unauthorized modifications can cause disasters, that there are very good reasons for strict procedures and proper engineering approval. Nobody today would tolerate a mechanic jury-rigging a cooling system with scrap parts and safety wire. That mechanic would be fired immediately, and the aircraft would be grounded until proper repairs could be made. But that modern approach assumes resources and time that weren't available in World War II. It assumes you can wait for proper parts and proper procedures. It assumes you're not fighting for survival with equipment that's failing faster than it can be properly fixed. Charlie and his fellow mechanics were operating under different rules, rules written by necessity, where the only thing that mattered was whether it worked and whether it kept pilots alive. Looking back from 8 decades later, it's easy to romanticize these kinds of stories. The scrappy mechanic outsmarting the engineers, the field improvisation that saved the day, the little guy proving that practical experience beats theoretical knowledge. But the reality was more complicated and often more ugly. For every modification like Charlie's that worked, there were probably others that failed or made things worse. There were probably aircraft lost and people killed because someone tried to fix something beyond their expertise. The difference was that Charlie got it right. He understood the problem well enough to see the solution. He had the skills to implement it properly, and he got lucky that his improvisation didn't create new problems worse than the one he was solving. But behind that success were probably dozens of other mechanics trying other modifications that didn't work, learning through failure what not to do. The Pacific Theater was particularly brutal on aircraft because everything about the environment was hostile to mechanical systems. The heat and humidity caused corrosion and electrical failures. The coral dust on the airstrips was incredibly abrasive and wore out engines faster. The distances involved meant aircraft were operating at the edge of their range, where any mechanical problem could be fatal. P-38s were far from the only aircraft with tropical problems. Early models of other fighters had issues with fuel systems vapor locking in the heat, radios that failed in high humidity, hydraulic systems that leaked or failed. The difference was that some of these problems got official engineering attention and some didn't, and the ones that didn't became field problems for mechanics to solve however they could. Charlie's cooling modification was special because it worked so well and spread so widely that it couldn't be ignored. It forced its way into official recognition despite breaking all the rules about how these things were supposed to happen. There's also an element of class in this story that's worth noting. Charlie and mechanics like him were mostly working-class guys, people who'd learned their skills in practical settings rather than engineering schools. people who probably felt intimidated by the engineers and officers making decisions about aircraft design. For someone like that to look at a system designed by college-educated engineers and say, "This is wrong, I know how to fix it," that took a certain amount of courage or maybe just desperation. And when it turned out he was right, when his fix worked better than the original design, that had to be validating in a way that went beyond just solving a technical problem. It was proof that practical knowledge and common sense had value even when dealing with sophisticated technology. The fact that the official response was basically to adopt his approach while trying not to make it too obvious that they were doing so, that had to be both satisfying and frustrating. The P-38 cooling modification became part of the oral tradition of aircraft maintenance, one of those stories that gets passed down from old mechanics to new ones as an example of creative problem-solving and thinking outside regulations. It's the kind of story that gets told in maintenance hangars and shops, often embellished with each retelling until Charlie becomes a mythical figure who single-handedly saved the entire Pacific Air War. The real story is less dramatic, but more interesting. It's not about one hero mechanic, it's about a culture of problem-solving and adaptation that existed throughout the maintenance community, where people like Charlie were exceptional but not unique, where improvisation and creative thinking were normal parts of the job. The modification itself was eventually superseded by improved P-38 models that had better cooling systems designed in from the factory, incorporating the lessons learned from the field modifications, along with other improvements. By late 1944, the cooling problems that had plagued early P-38s in the Pacific were mostly solved through a combination of official engineering changes and accumulated field experience. But those improved models were built on knowledge that came from places like Guadalcanal, from mechanics like Charlie, who found problems and fixed them without waiting for permission. It's one of those cases where the official history and the real history diverge. Officially, the P-38's cooling problems were solved through proper engineering development. In reality, they were solved by desperate improvisation that eventually got retroactive engineering approval. The story raises interesting questions about innovation and how it happens, because we tend to think of innovation as something that occurs in research labs and engineering departments, something done by trained experts following proper procedures. But some of the most important innovations in history came from people in the field dealing with real problems, people who had a different perspective precisely because they weren't bound by the assumptions and limitations that experts bring. Charlie wasn't trying to innovate. He wasn't trying to prove a point about engineering. He was just trying to get fighters back in the air using whatever means he had available. The fact that his solution turned out to be better than the original design was almost accidental, a side effect of approaching the problem from a different angle without preconceptions about how it was supposed to work. This pattern shows up everywhere. If you look for it, users of technology often develop better solutions than the designers because they understand the real-world context in ways designers can't anticipate. In modern military aviation, this kind of improvisation is much harder because aircraft are so complex and systems so integrated that modifications can have unexpected cascading effects. You can't just reroute a coolant line on an F-35 without potentially affecting a dozen other systems and triggering software errors. The increasing complexity of technology makes the kind of direct mechanical problem solving that Charlie did much more difficult, which is probably safer overall, but also means losing some of that adaptive capability that came from having mechanics who really understood their aircraft and could fix them creatively. There's a trade-off between reliability through standardization and flexibility through improvisation, and modern aviation has clearly chosen reliability, which is the right choice for peacetime operations, but might become a limitation in extended conflict where supply chains are disrupted and formal support structures break down. The P-38 cooling story is also a reminder that even sophisticated technology designed by experts can have fundamental flaws that only become apparent in actual use, and that the people closest to the problem are often best positioned to find solutions. It's an argument for listening to field reports seriously and empowering people at lower levels to experiment and adapt, while also maintaining enough oversight to prevent dangerous improvisation. Finding that balance is hard because the natural tendency of large organizations is to centralize control and standardize procedures, which makes sense for managing risk, but can also stifle the kind of creative problem-solving that kept those P-38s flying. If Charlie had gone through proper channels and waited for official approval for his modification, it probably would have taken months, and in those months, how many missions would have been scrubbed? How many pilots would have been forced to fly in unreliable aircraft? How many might have died because their engine failed at the wrong moment? His decision to just do it and ask forgiveness later saved lives at the risk of his career, which is the kind of calculation that people in desperate situations have to make. The fact that it worked out doesn't mean it was guaranteed to work out, and there's something sobering about thinking about all the times similar gambles didn't pay off, and we just never heard about them, because the people involved failed and got punished or forgotten. So if you want the takeaway from this whole story, here it is. Sometimes the best solution to a complex problem is a simple fix that breaks all the rules. And sometimes the people best equipped to find that solution are not the experts who designed the system, but the people who have to live with its failures every day. And sometimes progress happens not through proper channels and official procedures, but through someone deciding that getting the job done matters more than following regulations, and being willing to bet their career on being right about that. The modified P-38s with their improvised cooling systems flew thousands of combat missions in the Pacific. They shot down Japanese fighters and bombers. They escorted other aircraft on long-range missions. They did reconnaissance and ground attack. They did everything they were designed to do. And they did it reliably because a mechanic on Guadalcanal looked at a problem everyone else had accepted as unsolvable and decided to solve it anyway with whatever he had on hand. That's not just a story about aircraft maintenance. That's a story about human ingenuity and the refusal to accept limitations that don't make sense. And maybe that's why it's still worth telling all these years later. So next time you see something that's not working right and everyone's making excuses about why it can't be fixed, remember Charlie Boswell lying in the mud under a P-38 looking at coolant lines and thinking there has to be a better way, and then making that better way happen with scrap tubing and safety wire, and the confidence that practical knowledge sometimes beats engineering degrees, because that's how progress actually happens in the real world, not through committees and proper procedures, but through people who see problems and fix them because that's what needs to be done. If this story got you thinking differently about problem solving and innovation, hit that subscribe button because there are hundreds more stories like this waiting to be told.